Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Eric Heinze, and we're going to talk about the future of the left. Thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Okay, so I know you wrote a book about the future of the left. It's called Coming Clean, and I want to hear what your argument is in the book. So I was hoping that you could summarize it.
Yeah, sure, gladly. Obviously discussions about left and right, become instantly polarized nowadays, often reduced to very simplistic cliches, and often consisting of, just kind of missiles being fired back from one side to the other, very little nuance. And so that was exactly what I wanted to not do. I wanted to write a book about problems on the left. Of course, many people have done that. That's not new, and often in a constructive vein. It's not always culture wars. And I just wanted to try a new take on it, and to try to pick up some things that I think have been missing.
Okay, so the title of the book is Coming Clean. So that suggests that the left has to come clean with something, right? Like, what does the left have to come clean with?
One of the main points of the book is that much of progressive thought is, and really focusing on the left, kind of the focusing on the way, kind of Western progressive thought, because of course, progressives are not just in the West. Of course, we can find them in many places, but you have to start somewhere. And, the West is kind of our common cultural space, and is very, very influential internationally in non-Western leftist movements. Um, but fine. So in the West, progressives, uh, and I would say particularly over the last century or two, have had as a defining theme the fact that the rest of us have to come clean. What I mean is this: one of the amazing achievements of the left, if you were to ask me what has been the most important achievement of progressive thought or of leftist thought over, again, last century, 2 centuries, I would not pin it to any particular politician or party or movement or policy. I would say that the single most important accomplishment of the left has been to fundamentally redefine two things which are related. First, the concept of justice, and second, the concept of history. Let me start with history, and then I'll get back to coming clean. For generations, history, and in many places in the world, this is still the case, history essentially meant the high deeds of great men, right? And so, we don't need to go back far, to find a world in which, our parents or our grandparents sat in schoolrooms as kids, and basically history, meant everything sort of from Alexander the Great to Churchill or George Washington or, whoever it might be, Martin Luther King, right? The great deeds of great men, right? Very much about battlefields, about palaces, about parliaments. And one of the great achievements of the left has been to completely redefine what we mean when we talk about history and communicating history. It's the left which began to teach people that no, history is not about glorifying and celebrating and idolizing our past. It's about critiquing it. And so you and I think, because I don't know what kind of education you had, but if I had to put money on it, I would guess that your education, whatever you learned about history, however much or little you studied it, or even when you just kind of watch historical documentaries or read historical books, that history is fundamentally understood as an exercise of collective self-scrutiny, that we can only credibly talk about history and transmit history not simply by glorifying, George Washington and Abe Lincoln or whoever your heroes are, Thomas Jefferson, right? But that we have to fundamentally understand history as as scrutiny, as collective scrutiny of Western atrocities. So we can do the George Washington and we can do the Thomas Jefferson. I'm not saying that, that people on the left want to abolish that. Some do. I think most would not, actually. But that part of that also has to be transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, exploitation, workers' exploitation, patriarchy, heteronormativity. I would say, this is virtually unheard of in human history, that the very concept of history becomes fundamentally redefined as an exercise in collective self-scrutiny, as opposed to being, again, largely a question of celebration, commemoration, kind of a deferential history. And so these are things that I congratulate. I think, in fact, democracy, a constructive, productive democracy, is probably impossible without this redefinition of history. And so this, I think, is the left's probably single greatest achievement, is not, again, some policy or politician, but changing our minds, right? So that even conservatives have to take seriously. They can't just ignore if they're going to be taken seriously. The transatlantic slave trade, the colonialism, the patriarchy, the heteronormativity. They might have, their own take on it, right? But you just can't, if you want to be taken seriously, talk about history that way anymore.
You know what that
And
reminds me
so,
of?
oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of Howard Zinn's A People History. Like it's focused on colonialism, oppression, exploitation, right? You hear all the bad stuff that Columbus did to the indigenous people.
Well, and so, again, if I were just kind of jumping into the cultural wars and wanted to criticize the left, I would just want to get rid of all that, right? And we see this happening, right? When people want to get rid of, diversity programs, DEI, LGBTQ, whatever, right? This is them saying, I don't want to do history that way anymore, right? And that's not a game I want to play. I want to congratulate the left for fundamentally redefining what history is. And that's what I meant by also concomitantly redefining what we mean by justice. Justice as that exercise of collective self-scrutiny regarding our past. But, and here's where coming clean comes in. What I criticize the left for is they don't do this with their own history. And that, I think, is grievous and leads them to many really bad positions. And the worst part of this is that when I say this, it comes as a shock to many leftists who are sure that they do it, right? And they'll cite you, oh, well, look at a bit at, Habermas and this one and that one. No, of course, we've acknowledged our past, and we don't support Stalin anymore, and we don't support Mao anymore. And, we understand the atrocities. And one of the things I argue is that, yeah, there is such a thing as acknowledging. And it's very easy to acknowledge the past as simply mistakes. The problem is that when the left invites, or indeed exhorts, the rest of us, and again, rightly so, to do collective self-scrutiny, history as collective self-scrutiny, what's crucial to that endeavor is that we have to see certain injustices and atrocities as structural. We're not allowed to see them as just mistakes, just happenstance, as if they might as well never have happened. In a sense, we are taught that we have to understand that exploitation, oppression have been systemic, built into the very fabric of liberal democracy. Now, one of the things I point out in the book is that this is what the left doesn't do. The left will acknowledge the atrocities of Stalin, of Mao, of Pol Pot, of North Korea, the whole long list, but only as mistakes. Oh, well, that wasn't the real socialism. Oh, but we don't support that anymore. Oh, but we've moved on. And I'm saying this is an enormous asymmetry, an enormous disparity, right? That Western injustices are inbuilt, structural, systemic, still with us. We have to know history because it's actually still going on in the present, when the people who are teaching us this essentially think that they've come clean of their past. Oh, we don't do that anymore. Oh, that wasn't the real socialism, and so forth. That's not possible. It's not possible that history does work this way. And that either all of us are still deeply embedded in our past commitments, or we're free of them. But one of the great mistakes on the left is the idea that they've come clean and now it's just for the rest of us to do. Because I think there's too much evidence that this is not true at all. So yes, on the left, you'll get the acknowledgments, but look at it this way. Imagine, and I paint some scenarios like this in the book. I say, imagine you have a group of students and they want to do, and we've all seen this, they want to do something like maybe, I don't know, Women's History Month or Black History Month or LGBTQ History Month, which will consist of presentations about oppression and so forth. Right? And we're all used to this. We've probably participated in some. But imagine, students put forward a proposal and they ask for whatever money or whatever classrooms or whatever it is, and the administration says to them, "Oh, well, that wasn't the real liberal democracy. That's we're done with that. We don't believe in slavery anymore." Which is true, by the way, right? You'd be seen as, and that would be seen as a fatuous. That wouldn't just be seen as kind of lacking sympathy or lacking empathy or lacking understanding. That would just be seen as fatuous, as stupid. To say, oh, but that wasn't, well, we don't do that anymore. So how can this be a very enlightened response when it comes from the very people who are teaching us how to do this history? This is what I mean by coming clean. Sorry that it was a bit of a long-winded answer.
I hear what you're saying in regards to the left not being, I guess, self-critical enough, right? And to not only acknowledge, but acknowledge that the ideals that the left currently holds led to those atrocities in the past. I hear what you're saying. I do hear a response from the left that, oh yeah, like, well, that wasn't really socialism, right? Whatever Stalin did, that's not really what we wanted, you know? I do
Yeah.
hear that. I mean, in some sense, I probably is true. I mean, like, I mean, people who are in favor of socialism probably don't have something like Stalin in mind, right? And Mao Zedong in mind. Um,
Well,
but then,
yeah,
yeah,
not
well,
today. It's
yeah,
amazing how much support some of these dictators had from the Western, not from the whole Western left. Again, we've agreed there's no such thing as the left. But in fact, some of these very oppressive movements continued to enjoy substantial support and at least legitimacy on the part of Western leftists, actually, for a very, very long time, long after their atrocities have been revealed, usually on the, well, the West is just as bad. Well, yeah, yeah. If the West is just as bad, right? Yeah, that's why we do all of this, not only this very active study, this kind of public dissemination. So where is that on the left? And that's one of the, right? One of the things I say in the book is that, I talk about historical memory, which I say takes place in two stages. The first is, yes, acknowledgement. We don't deny, so we don't deny that slavery happened. We don't deny that the Holocaust happened. We don't deny patriarchy and so forth, right? But what's always been crucial on the left is what I call step two, active engagement, public dissemination. Now, what I'm saying is that when the left engages with its own history, yeah, we'll usually get step one, because that's very easy to do. Yeah, Stalin terrible, right? Um, we I see no evidence anywhere of this step two. The step two becomes something that all the rest of us are expected to do. All the rest of us have to sit through the DEI and all of that. And again, I'm not against those programs, actually. Right. Oh, but again, whatever universities you've worked at or studied at or familiar with, how many times did you see leftists saying, "Oh yeah, and we also actually have to do a socialist history month or socialist history day," and also
yeah,
show how our ideals also could be distorted and used actually to justify mass atrocity, which indeed not all of us, but many of us lent legitimacy to and sometimes even zealously supported. When have you ever seen this? Can you name me one example?
yeah. No, I don't think I can think of any examples. So maybe one example could be, I mean, like, if they were to enact it, would be something like, I don't know, a class on the harms of central planning of the economy or something like that, right? Because that would be one of the harms of the ideas that came from the left, but we don't really hear about that. There's no harm of central planning of the economy training that people have to go through.
Well, well, and it would be damn useful. Just as we have to learn about the excesses and dangers of capitalism, which we should learn. But why are not both histories of equal importance? they've certainly affected equal numbers of lives, if not, well, roughly equal. I mean, to be generous, I'll say roughly equal numbers of lives, millions on either side. I don't believe in comparing atrocities. And even that, it's kind of funny that you know, just to try to give the benefit of the doubt, you phrased it as a kind of, a kind of a semester-long seminar. But yeah, then trying to understand this is just, a kind of program, a day long, just an open event for the public where, we just talk in very simple terms about the horrors. Why is there? Again, when I say why, I think it's good that there's enthusiasm for teaching about the horrors of slavery and the horrors of colonialism and so forth. Why? Where is that enthusiasm for teaching the horrors? On the left, I mean, I know people will do it on the right, but why would the left want that when, again, crucial, central to leftist thought for more than a century has been the duty of self-scrutiny? I mean, literally, auto-critique used to be a pillar term on the left. Curiously, it's died out in recent decades, but still, I think most leftists, they really think they do it, and they really don't, because we would see it. It's not simply a matter of what happens on your pillow at night and going through your head. Certainly not if you think that everyone else needs to go through training programs.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. But let me push back a little bit. So maybe there's some asymmetry here, right? Maybe there are certain ideas that the left criticizes uh, is is I guess more defensible because we still see those ideas and philosophies in the world, right? So for instance, colonialism, like, okay, yeah, like people on the right are not necessarily arguing for colonialism, but there are certain common threads and certain, I guess, um, ideologies that really closely align with colonialism that are still present today, and perhaps it kind of reemerges in different contexts, right? So, for instance, I think like the colonial mindset will probably overlap with a lot of the people who are more anti-immigration, right? Because they think that there's some sort of I don't know, like value to the type of immigrant that the country accepts, right? And they think that some people are more valuable than other people, and that's closely related to maybe cultural stereotypes or religious stereotypes, right? We don't want these uncivilized people in our country. We want these civilized people in our country, right? And so that's kind of a colonial type of mindset. I mean, again, we're not saying that we should take over them, but there are these, I guess, racist and discriminatory beliefs that just kind of reemerge in different contexts. So maybe the left feels like there needs to be education on this stuff because the this I don't know, this type of negative way of thinking is just it's still there. It's still here.
And to which I think the answer is so obvious. Autocracy is not still with us. And again, particularly if there has been self-reflection and an acknowledgement that, yeah, in fact, that never was the real socialism. In fact, it was really just the brutalist forms of autocracy. How on earth how have we washed ourselves of that past?
Yeah. Is autocracy a left thing though?
Well, but this is the point. Was slavery liberal democratic? Right? Was patriarchy? Was heteronormativity? That's the point, right? There's here. Let me read you a quote from my book. Right? I'm quoting Slavoj Žižek. Right? He's been a leading figure on the left or at least on a part of the left for a long time. He says, yes, the liberal West is hypocritical, applying its high standards very selectively. But hypocrisy means you violate the standards you proclaim. And in this way, you open yourself up to inherent criticism. When we criticize the liberal West, we use its own standards. And it's never even occurred to Slavoj Žižek or anybody else that you have to do the same thing with the left. And that's what this book is about. Okay, yeah, good. He's absolutely right. Let's hold the West to its own standards. And while we're at it, let's hold the left to its own standards. He doesn't whisper a word about that, right?
Yeah.
It's so close to him that he doesn't see it. And unfortunately, this is not just about Slavoj Žižek.
Yeah.
Because again, where is the evidence of it? Where do we see it? Now, you're right. Absolutely. Autocracy has been as much on the far right as it's been on the far left. But all the more reason why it would seem to me to be again, if the duty is on the rest of us to, as Zizek said, to understand how the West failed to live up to its own standards, then wouldn't we have the same duty, the same imperative to ask, yeah, how did the left end up supporting one hideous autocrat after another, regardless of whether it was real socialism or not? I mean, the fact is there was substantial support, or at least a lending of legitimacy to the Soviet Union up until the day it collapsed. It's not as if, well, by the 1950s, the whole Western left had abandoned it. That simply was not true. Some did, some didn't. And again, at the very least, the idea of, that's why I use this phrase, lending legitimacy. The idea that, well, yes, of course, Soviet Union, yeah, they've had their crimes, they've done their bad things. So is the West, right? This kind of, that each is as bad as each other. This is actively lending legitimacy. And this happened up until the very day that the Soviet Union dissolved, up until the very day that Mao's Cultural Revolution was over, and so on. So if, as you say, the left sees vestiges of earlier forms of oppression still continuing, good, yes, they're right to point that out. We do need to take a look at that, such as the examples you mentioned. And we have to do the same thing with respect to the left's own history. You see, I mean, if you look at, the problems of, autocracy, which have become so current in the United States with Trump, right? And I think without reflection, we would think, okay, so who was positioned most arch opposite Trump? Well, Trump kind of far right, therefore arch opposite surely would be far left. This is completely false. It's completely false. If we look at and we don't even have to go far left. If we look at, much of the left, we see people who, without pause, without interruption for more than a century, were always lending legitimacy to autocratic regimes, and sometimes of the most brutal sort. And so my first question then was, what is it exactly about Trump that you don't like? Right? I mean, many of these people were very enthusiastic about Chavez, who did the same thing. It seems to me that the problem with Trump is first and foremost the hollowing out, the erosion of democratic institutions, literally the systematic dismantling of democracy or of liberal democracy. But the left has been supporting regimes who have done that for more than a century, again, right up to our own lifetimes. It's exactly what Chavez did, with a massive amounts of support. You'll find your academic colleagues who don't have much bad to say about Chavez, Maduro, to say about that regime, which incidentally has created more than 7 million refugees. About a third of the country is emptied out, right? So it's curious that these are people who claim to care about refugees, right? And so it's not at all clear to me that, because I see this positioning happening, that, solid left or far left is arch opposite to far right and to Trumpism and to autocracy, because you cannot name for me a single year in the past 100 where substantial portions of the left were not at least lending legitimacy to, if not zealous support, to some autocratic regime, and often to several.
So I think it'll help me better understand your position if you give me another example of an idea that the left traditionally supported and that led to an atrocity. So one thing that you mentioned was, they supported certain autocrats. Maybe some of them supported, central planning, right?
Yeah.
Like what would be like another thing?
Well, extrapolating from central planning, again, nationalization of, of agriculture, which caused famines, for example.
Okay.
Purges, purges. Again, much of what we see Trump doing is, in German, there's a word for this, Gleichschaltung, right? In other words, this is something that Hannah Arendt, really pinned down in her, still amazing study of totalitarianism, where essentially you eliminate what we would commonly call, separations of powers or independence of different branches of government to ensure their integrity, and to ensure that, they're kind of placing checks on each other. And this is the first thing that an autocrat dismantles. So Gleichschaltung means literally, putting and they're making the same, right? And so that you get rid of all the experts from all of the important administration, and you're just putting your own people, regardless of whether they have any competence. What they need is loyalty to you, right? This is happening. I mean, this is how you do autocracy, left or right. And this is what Hugo Chavez did, and what Maduro still does. Is what Castro did. And these people have had considerable admiration among our colleagues for no other reason that, well, they stood up to the West. As if that's what makes their people's lives better, their population's lives better. you know. And meanwhile, again, you've scarcely had periods where there are not people trying to escape Cuba. And again, Venezuela, as I said, produced, lost a third of its population. And again, it's a regime that has been, supported by the same people who are telling us that, what a problem it is to deal with refugees, and, how we need to have a humanitarian attitude, and how our own policies support the creation of refugee problems. Well, so again, my book is simply suggesting that the left can only be credible when it does what it tells the rest of us to do, because it doesn't. It just does not do collective self-critique as much as it has this mythology of doing it. And I named several examples in the book of where the left thinks it's doing self-critique and it's not.
Okay. So
it's usually just letting itself off the hook, and that's very different. In fact, it's the arch opposite. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I wanted to get back to the other thing that you were going to mention. You said one part of it is history. The other part of it is what?
Justice.
Justice. Okay, so the left, you were saying there are two big things that the left have kind of changed or molded in terms of like our mentality and our beliefs. One is that is construed history. It's changed our understanding of history from just not just, understanding certain events, but as a way to collectively critique what happened in the past in order to fight injustice. Right? So that's it's changed our understanding of the role of history. And now you're saying that the other thing that the left has changed is our idea of justice or how we fight for justice?
Because those are part and parcel of the same thing. Again, a big achievement of the left, something which I enormously admire. I can't, I can't imagine my own sort of intellectual space without these contributions of the left. The fact that the left made justice about history. You don't have to go so far back in Western history when justice meant, the will of the Lord, right? Or just was tied to, rather abstract ideals that were mostly wedded to privilege, right? Justice was, again, what, the great deeds of big men, right? But the idea that we understand justice fundamentally through a collectively self-critical approach to our own history, this is a radical idea. And I think it's been pretty successful, again, because I don't think you'd see many examples of it. In fact, I don't think you'd see any, right? I think, you can find many civilizations, which certainly value, well, critique of a certain sort, right? Kind of self-reflection, that sort of thing. Self-reflection itself is not any kind of new idea. But the idea that it is a moral imperative, that it is our duty, and not just a small elite, not just in the seminar room, but for our whole public, for our whole society, to understand its history critically as an exercise in collective self-scrutiny. I don't think we would find this anywhere in world history. I stand open to be corrected on that, because I would love to study any such society that felt that it had to teach its whole people to understand itself in terms of all of its evils. And again, I unbelievably admire this. I think it's an enormous achievement of the left, and only of the left.
I'm trying to understand what you're saying exactly, how the left has changed the understanding of justice. You're saying that before justice was just understood as what, like the might makes right, or just like what certain powerful people did. It wasn't necessarily what the left is fighting for today, which is more of like a change in our social institutions such that people, have like a fair chance at living a decent, minimally decent life. Like I'm just trying to understand what you're saying.
Yeah, no, again, I think there are long traditions of understanding justice basically in terms of certain abstract ideals, which might be good ones, right? So maybe, again, I think you can find whole societies in the West. We don't have to go back very far to find societies in the West for whom justice essentially meant, as I said, the will of the Lord. If you wanted to understand justice, you had to read the Bible, right? And most of the people who founded our societies, knew the Bible virtually by heart and cited it and used it and understood this as a guide to justice. Um, and even as Western folk started to become more secular, it's often been noticed that secular thought was in many ways just a secularization of Christian values that had come before. But again, kind of just certain moral values. So justice is certain moral values. And again, I don't say that this has entirely disappeared or that it's a bad thing. I don't think the left has completely overthrown it. I think the left is vastly reinterpreted, right? By now defining justice as as understanding one's own society as constituted by, as structured by, as having been built upon systemic mass injustice, oppression, brutality, violence. I do think that this is a very new way of understanding history and of understanding justice.
Okay. So then how does this
And I think
understanding of
you've sorry, yeah. Sorry.
yeah, I just want to understand how this conception of justice relates to what has to become clean on the left.
Yeah. And there's the left should keep it's this conception of justice. It's good. Again, I think that's the real revolution that the left has successfully achieved. But it has to start applying it to the left's own history. It's not enough just to acknowledge and dismiss, which we constantly hear, right? When someone says, "Oh yes, of course Stalin did terrible things," that's not an acknowledgement. That's a dismissal. A dismissal. It's what I call a dismissive apologetic, right? Oh yeah, of course Stalin did bad things, right? As if let me tell you a story. When I was talking about when the book first came out about 2 months ago, I was in Chicago just doing a little presentation, and there was a woman there who teaches, at one of the local universities, and she said that when they hired somebody new, he declared himself, and this would have been, I guess, within the last few years. He declared himself well, as a Marxist, right? And then someone on the panel, as you would expect from an interview panel, they're meant to kind of challenge you a little bit on your supposed expertise, mention Stalinism. And he replied, "Don't talk to me about Stalinism." This I find fascinating. In other words, he was saying, number one, completely irrelevant. And number two, it's virtually a moral fault to have raised that you should actually almost feel culpable for having done that, right? He wasn't really simply, he wasn't even, it wasn't a polite request. It was essentially an injunction. You are not to. You would be committing a kind of a trespass, a moral trespass to right. You fundamentally don't understand Marxism if you're now going to ask me about Stalinism. Now you imagine if somebody were to apply for a job in, say, 19th century American history, right? Talking about this president and that president, some of the, oh yeah, but what about slavery? Don't talk to me about slavery. The person would be considered not simply misguided, but completely incompetent. They wouldn't be hired to empty the rubbish bins. This guy got the job because, of course, he in that one sentence, he didn't simply tell them that they were wrong. He kind of put them to shame. He kind of corrected them. He let them know that they don't understand what they're talking about if they ask him about Stalin. How does this work? How do we put these two things together? That the Western history is unthinkable without its injustice, whereas leftism is only thinkable without its injustice. How did we get to this point? How did leftists allow themselves to get to this point while claiming that self-scrutiny is integral to what they do and therefore integral to what the rest of us had to do? And it really has gone this far. I know that's only one anecdote, but again, my book doesn't even include this one because the book was already published. But I do, talk about similar cases where essentially the same thing is going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I I mean, do you think it's just a result of tribalism? Like the leftist, it doesn't want to fully acknowledge to the point where they feel like they have to take action and, start, changing the way that people become educated to so that they don't repeat these mistakes in the past. I mean, is that just a form of tribalism? Like, I'm not entirely sure.
I think it is. And one of the things I say in the book is that on the left's own accounts of what it does, and again, I mean accounts going back over decades, centuries, leftism cannot be tribalist. Let me put this another way. Maybe you even heard this, I don't know, listening in your car to NPR or reading whatever. Very often when people on the left, have written a book or done it for whatever, done a film, a documentary, whatever it may be, I'm struck that actually very rarely do they say to us at the end, okay, now go out and vote for so and so. In other words, they don't necessarily want to be prescriptive about the action to be taken. There's not necessarily a lot of agreement, either on the left or on the right or on the center, about what should now next be done. That's almost another problem. What instead you hear is we need to have a discussion about, we need to understand, we need to talk about, right? It's focused clearly on what has been. And so, in fact, often you'll hear the phrase, we need to be honest about. Very similar to the idea of coming clean. We need to be honest about, right? So I've written this book about slavery. I've written this book about feminism. I've written this book about LGBTQ. I'm not saying that you necessarily have to vote for X or Y. All I'm saying is we need to be honest about this past. We need to recognize this past. Yeah. Now, that's all I'm saying to the leftists. Just be honest about what you're doing. Don't say that you do collective self-criticism. And in fact, you've never done it. There's no evidence that you have done it. Then all you do are, kind of a series of basically dismissals, right? There are scholarly exceptions. I can point you to, again, people like Habermas or Claude Lefebvre, or, I can point you to a few people who did study in the seminar room, essentially, problems on the left. But again, you never attended a training program as a result of it. That's the point. It never took this, what I'd call step 2 of memory politics, of it needs to be mass disseminated. So yes, I think you're right. It's tribalism. You have tribalism all over the political spectrum. That's sort of particularly leftist evil. But then be honest about it. Tell us, yeah, we're not going to scrutinize ourselves. We want you to scrutinize you. Be honest about what you're doing if your message to us is constantly that we need to be honest about what we're doing.
Yeah.
Right?
So do you
If
think
we
that
need to be
they're
honest, right? So just be honest about the choices you're making. If you've decided, no, you're not going to talk about Stalin, no, you're not going to talk about Mao, and the ways in which the left, and leftist discourses were actively implicated in all of this, and the way millions of people still suffer from the consequences, fine, but be clear. Say it. Say, we will not do that. We want you to look at your past. Just say what you want to do. Maybe you're right. Just say it. Explain it. Don't say that you're doing precisely the opposite of what you're doing.
yeah.
Because
Do
then why
you
shouldn't all the rest of us do the same? Then all of a sudden those are the people who are making Donald Trump right when he dismantles DEI. They're making him right. And I think that's a problem. I think it's a shame.
how much of this do you think it's the product of academics mainly being on the left?
Well, yeah.
Because I feel like the people who are pushing for these things
Yeah.
are maybe are in academia, and they just, they have that prestige attached to their positions, and so they're kind of utilizing it to, pass these, DEI trainings and implement these DEI trainings and stuff like that.
Yeah, and of course you get bubbles and mutual reinforcement and safety zones and comfort zones. And again, most leftists will tell you that they don't will be quite surprised if you tell them that they're in a comfort zone, right? They think that they're on the front lines, right? Again, even the ones that have, never left their seminar room or their computer, right? They think that they're on the front lines. Um, and so to tell them that they're living in a bubble or in a comfort zone, yeah, that's just not going to register with them because they don't see themselves this way. They see themselves as fighting the good fight. But yeah, I mean, I do think that, again, I'm not even saying that we should necessarily be hiring more conservatives. If there were more conservatives, yeah, then they would each be kind of putting each other on the spot, and maybe each would feel more conscious of the fact that they need to explain and justify, and not just kind of complacently assume massive amount of doctrine as proven fact. But I'm not saying that we necessarily should do that. I'm not saying that we necessarily have to go out and start hiring conservatives. I say hire the best person, right? But still, if you're not going to seriously do the self scrutiny, then don't say that you do, because every leftist you meet will say that they do it and will think that they're good at it until
Hmm.
you start asking for the evidence. And then they'll tell you don't really know what you're talking about.
Huh. Yeah. Okay. So
And
then,
that's why at the end of my book, and let me explain to you something, just so we're absolutely clear, there is not a single page in my book where I tell the left to stop doing anything it's doing. There's not a single page which says stop doing DEI, stop doing identity politics, stop putting trans women in sport. There's not a single page where I do that. Again, I'm leaving that to everyone else who's fighting the cultural wars. That is of no interest to me. So I don't tell them to stop doing anything they're doing. I just tell them to start doing what they're telling the rest of us to do. And I've been telling the rest of us to do for more than 100 years. So I want to be really clear about that, right? So my book is not about taking any leftist policy and trashing it.
hmm hmm
But I do think that the left leads itself into very problematical positions because of its relentlessly one-sided readings of these supposedly critical histories. Because half of a critical history is not a critical history. It's just one set of mythologies replacing another set. One of the most important messages that you'll hear on the left is we need to tell the untold stories. Again, this goes back to, history is not just about the high deeds of great men. It's also about what slaves did and women did and LGBTQ people and everything. And so you'll often hear this phrase, we need to tell the untold stories. What you will not hear from a single one is that they are telling these untold stories upon a high heap of untold stories. I'm not saying they should stop telling those untold stories. Why do we get no acknowledgement that that they are doing just as much to keep certain stories untold? Because they never tell them about the tens of millions of lives damaged or even destroyed, with effects still going on right up to the present by regimes that the left, again, at least lent legitimacy to, and often zealous support, and often long after atrocities have been uncovered.
yeah, what makes this topic really confusing and complicated is that these values are not necessarily just shared on one side, people like on the left or people on the right. Like the values could be commonly shared, the values can shift, right? I think a lot of people on the left think that the values that we hold now in common as a society were previously left values, but because the left has won certain battles, it's become like accepted, right? So, for instance, it's like in women's equality. Well, like, I would say that the left would probably see that as um, a mission that the left had for a long time, and then now it's won, and then people, and now we all acknowledge that it's a good thing that, that women have, the right to vote and that women can, have jobs and stuff like that, right? Maybe same thing about, like, slavery, maybe same thing about, other, like, fundamental rights. Like, the left, I think, sees themselves as, again, kind of like this social justice warrior and look at all the progress that we've made in the past, right? So like the story, like you said, the way that they see history, it's almost like this is all the bad stuff that happened, and and this is like the way that the people on the left have changed it to make it better, and so they're the heroes of the story.
And this would be the most supreme irony, right? Because so, again, just replacing one set of mythologies with another, right? Again, that's like painting again, Washington, Jefferson, and their class as nothing but heroes. Washington and Jefferson also achieved some important things, at least for their time, right? At a time when most of government was just despotic, in much of the world, certainly in Europe, right? Europe was basically absolute monarchies, and so they, right? But we would be seen as simply incompetent if those were the only stories we were to tell today. about Washington and Jefferson, and again about their whole class. We're not considered competent if we don't tell the rest of the story.
You know what I feel like might be another good example is, maybe some sort of I mean, you might be seeing that now, like a course or some sort of training program that highlights the achievements of the West, right? That would be pretty anti-woke, like, woke people won't like that. It's almost like we can't praise the West, the West is bad, America is bad, right? Look at all the stuff that the West has done. And so kinda it would push back against that type of narrative, right? Whereas, like, I feel like people on the right, conservatives, are much more willing to be like, "Yeah, America is an awesome place to live. The West is an awesome place to live. Our values are better than their values. Our societies are better than their societies," right? They're much more likely to kind of say that, right? So maybe if they were the ones in power, or if the left were, like, more, like, self-critical and wanted to implement this type of change, maybe they would try to pass and try to implement these training programs that highlight the achievements of the West, something like that. Or like the good stuff about capitalism, right? The people on the left generally don't praise capitalism.
Yeah, I'm not praising any set of mythologies. And again, this is what I consider part of the genuine achievements of the left, is putting critique at the center. Right. And you're right. There have been some right wing backlashes. I would be a bit careful about that. I would say the way you've characterized a kind of right wing backlash of wanting to kind of re-glorify the West, I would say I think we were seeing maybe more of that, say maybe 2 or 3 decades ago. Um, Now, curiously enough, again, if you look at the kind of far right, the Trump right, uh, it's all of a sudden very admiring of places that don't share traditionally American values at all. All of a sudden, people like J.D. Vance and others, they're praising Viktor Orban. Up until recently, Trump is praising Putin many times. Right now, all of a sudden, he doesn't like him, right? And so I would say that that kind of right wing backlash that you're talking about, we saw maybe 2 or 3 decades ago. Now I'm not so sure. Many of the values that get praised are not American. Certainly capitalism, yes, and even then, a curious kind of capitalism, not necessarily the kind of capitalism that people have had had in mind 10 or 20 years ago. That would be a difficult debate, right? But even you're leaving aside capitalism. Much of what gets I don't know how anybody could in the same breath praise Thomas Jefferson and Viktor Orban. Yeah, if that's not ignorance of history, I really don't know what is. And so it's not even clear to me that this kind of Trumpian right is about much admiration for what I think you and I might identify as achievements of the West, right? They're dismantling parliamentary democracy. They're not constructing it. They're dismantling the rule of law. They're dismantling liberal constitutionalism and so forth.
Yeah, I
So
don't know if
even that,
that's like a right wing thing necessarily. I don't know if
I'm
that's
talking
due
about
to
far
Trump.
right, far right.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh, okay. Yeah,
yeah,
because
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
some of that stuff just might be because it's Trump.
yeah.
You know, like, he's an interesting character.
Well, my God, he certainly has plenty of people who are going along with his project. One man cannot do this sort of thing alone. When it's just one man, then he's a weirdo. But but when it's so many people who are willing to go along with it, it's a movement. And again, it's Vance. It seems to me that praises Orban as much as, if not more than Trump, actually. You know, and I suppose he's also a mouthpiece for whoever has overseen his advancement. And so we are talking about a movement here. But anyway, be that as it may, just to get back to your original point. So yeah, I would say that there was a certain kind of more traditionalist, maybe almost more moderate conservatism, maybe more prominent, say, a decade or two ago, which was about saying, wait a minute, the West has made some good achievements. But again, in my book, I'm not really in my book. I don't spend a lot of time praising anybody, right? I like the idea of critique. I like that achievement on the left, and that's the one thing I do praise them for, is that giving us this mindset which is not about praise, right? It's about scrutiny, and So I can only repeat, this I think is a genuine achievement. It's maybe the most important. And so I'm not interested in, which is the mythology we want to push. And I think this is part of the problem here, is that, the same people who claim to be teaching us to think critically about society and history actually deal in much more mythology than they're willing to admit, precisely through their untold story. That's how you do mythology. It's not about the story you tell, it's about the story that you conceal. And while the rest of us are actually coming to terms with things like slavery and patriarchy and heteronormativity and so forth, I don't see this happening on the left at all. In other words, this reckoning with, wait a minute, we have to understand how what we stand for has actually come out of our histories of engagement with brutal regimes, just as the rest of us are expected to do.
Yeah. So I think the case of, central planning is pretty clear, but that's more of like an economic, philosophy or idea. Is there a social value or a social idea or a social, theory that the left has traditionally pushed and that has led to atrocities? And that the left currently does not acknowledge or doesn't want to acknowledge or doesn't want to critique itself because it traditionally pushed that value?
Liberation and egalitarianism. The number, and not that these are bad ideals, just as liberal democracy is not a bad ideal, but the quantity and extent of brutality that were committed, again, year after year, by regimes proclaiming values of liberation and egalitarianism is unfathomable.
When you say liberation and egalitarianism,
Mhm.
that I mean, again, I maybe I just I'm not understanding what you're saying. Like, I'm seeing those as more like economic concepts, but you don't like. Are you referring to them in a different context?
Well, I mean, economics is part of society. I'm not sure there's any such thing as just an economic a concept if it's a concept of any consequence, right? Right. I mean, right. Socialism was an economic system for bringing about more than just food in people's bellies, and this was always clear in everything that socialists were saying and writing and publishing and teaching. It was always about more than just filling up people's bellies, right? And I never saw economics as just filling up people's bellies, right? Economics, right, is also about helping people across the board to achieve a certain kind of life, which is infused with all sorts of values. So I'm not sure I see anything as just an economic value.
Yeah, I don't think I'm expressing myself clearly. So when you say liberation, what do you mean? I understand that to be liberation from, the bourgeoisie or something like the economic oppression of the elites. That's how I understand it.
Sure. That's a lot. That's a lot of it, right? I mean, when we get to sort of European colonialism, French colonialism, British colonialism, Dutch colonialism, so forth, again, whether these were certainly economic systems, whether we should understand them as only economic systems without also having been cultural systems and social systems, I would question, right? So you can look at British or French or Dutch or Spanish, Portuguese colonialism from a fundamental economic point of view, but not only from that point of view. And a lot of post-colonial writing is not only about economics, right? If you think all the way back to someone like Frantz Fanon, right? Writing in the 1950s and 60s, this man trained. He was not trained as as an economist, but as a psychiatrist, and right, and all of a sudden he's explaining colonialism not just as an economic system, right, but as a way of fundamentally uh, shaping and imprisoning minds and the way we understand our lives. Right, this was his phenomenal set of insights. He could have just talked about economics, and many people have talked about colonialism that way, and it's very useful. And you're right that these were often Marxist discourses, particularly during, the kind of the high tide of decolonization. Marxist discourses, Leninist discourses were often very much a part of that, but already someone like Fanon, and we could name others, Aimé Césaire and others, right, who are also understanding this as right, or James Baldwin, right, who are understanding this, well, okay, yeah, economics is certainly part of this and driving this, but these are total human systems. These are about culture, about society, about psychology, about the way humans relate to each other. This has been, I think there's been an enormous amount of what it has meant to understand something like colonialism or racism, or for that matter, patriarchy or heteronormativity.
Mhm. So then to kind of wrap things up, it sounds like the solution then, right? Like you're saying you don't think the left should stop it's saying the things that it says and fighting for the things that it fights for. But what it should do is apply the same standards to itself. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that that makes sense. That's pretty straightforward. Um, so perhaps the way to do that then is not focus on left versus right, not focus on, the different tribes that are out there, but to focus on the ideas,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is is liberation a good idea? Okay, generally, yes, it's a good idea, right? Historically, how did people fight for liberty? Okay, well, maybe in this context, it was good. In this context, it was not very good, right? And the left just has to be open and honest about that, right? And same thing with egalitarianism. Yeah, maybe in some context, right, it would be a good thing, but historically, in this context, it did not work out very well at all. And the left has to do more than just acknowledge it, but it actually has to kind of treat it as something to be reminded of.
Yeah. In other words, yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a very good summary. A lot of leftism is not again. If you go back to that quote by Slavoj Žižek, it's not about saying that the Western values were wrong. It's about showing how the West used its own values to bring about just the opposite. It's used values of equality to entrench inequality. It used values of liberty to entrench values of slavery or domination. But the left did the same.
Yeah, no,
And
that's
again, where are those training programs? Where are those commemorations?
yeah. There should be a certificate for for passing a training program that explains the harms of central planning or something like that. It's like, look at this certificate I got. Okay, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Jason, as always, for your probing and perfectly accurate questions and challenges. That's the only way to do it.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.